Here is how to implement a liberalization shock in this new CGE model that includes the Armington hypothesis. So I start by keeping a record of the initial values of the exogenous variables, that is to say the one I will change with the shock here studied. I remind you that by exogenous variables, I mean variables that are changed by the modeler externally to the model and which are therefore not explained by the model. So here the shock will concern the customs duty on imports. We keep a record of this initial value by declaring a parameter by the instruction parameter, and the name of this parameter is tm underscore. So it means it is the buffer parameter for customs duty. The suffix underscore is generally used to indicate a buffer parameter, that is to say a parameter where I keep the initial value of a parameter or an exogenous variable. So by the instruction tm underscore in sector I is equal to tm in sector I assign values from tm in sector I in tm underscore in sector I before annuling tm in sector I. And so the idea is to keep initial value of these exogenous variables in record in order to be able, when considering the results, to compare initial and final values of these exogenous variables. So the shock here is tm in sector I is equal to 0. So it means that I cancel the import duties in each sector. Then I asked for a solve of the model with the instruction solve macro underscore prod, which is the name of the model, using the solver CNS. Then I can study and interpret the results. Here I am asking the calculation of a certain number of parameters. I first declare these parameters. So these are rates of variation in percentage of the variables production by sector, labor remuneration, capital remuneration, consumption prices, national income, imports and exports. Then I define these parameters. I calculate these relative variation rates defined in percentage terms, which is why I multiply by 100 by comparing the current value of these endogenous variables, for example y.l in sector I, with the initial value y0 in sector I. I remind you that the suffix .l defines the current value of a variable, and the parameter y0 in sector I is the initial value of the variable y. Finally, I request the display of these parameters by the display instruction. So here are the results. With regard to changes in exports and imports, the strong growth of imports in the industrial sector is particularly noticeable. It should be noted that there was only one custom duty, and this duty is in the industrial sector. And this customs duty was high at more than 82%. It should be noted that there is no constraint on the external balance, which adjusts to this shock. The exchange rate is by assumption constant. We therefore have a very different evolutions of imports and exports, and this implies a deterioration of the trade balance. This obviously leads to a drop in import prices in the industrial sector, and therefore a drop in consumer prices in this sector. This is a drop of more than 2%. This may seem small, but initially imports represent a small share of the production of industrial goods, less than 7%. I therefore recommend that you also look at the evolutions of prices. So what is interesting for this economy is that when prices decrease, it has a positive effect on consumption, household consumption, intermediate consumption, and consumptions of capital goods. It's worth noting that the industrial good is the main input in the three sectors. So this therefore has a positive effect on production, except in the industrial sector, where the recovery in consumption is mainly beneficial to imports and not to local production. Overall, economic activity is growing, and therefore the demand for production factors is growing. So the remunerations of labor and capital increases. And this is particularly beneficial to labor because production is increasing in the agricultural sector and services, and both sectors are labor intensive. As the remunerations of labor and capital increases, the national income is increasing. It's a new source of growth in household consumption. You can, of course, look at the results on the other variables, and for example, on public expenditures. This policy reform has a negative impact on public expenditures. Why? Because first, custom revenues are cancelled, so this reduces public revenue. And second, since the public balance is assumed to be constant, public expenditures must be reduced. And so, obviously, the provisions of public goods must be affected in this economy, and therefore the impact on welfare can be questioned, because welfare depends on the consumption of private goods, but also of the availability of public goods. So this is an issue that we will address later in a third curriculum, but right now you can make the difference between the effect on private consumption and the effect on welfare. There is also a positive effect on investment. This is explained by the fact that, on the one hand, there is a slight increase in national savings. This is normal. The saving rate is assumed to be constant, and the national income increases. On the other hand, the public solde is supposed to be constant. Finally, there is a deterioration in the foreign trade balance due to the growth in imports following the cancellations of customs duty. So it is straightforward that investment augments because of the macroeconomic equilibrium, which is savings minus investment plus public solde is equal to foreign trade solde. The interpretations of the result will be refined during the third curriculum.